You never know who you're messing with until it's too late. The words echoed in the crisp morning air, and as the sun climbed higher, the tension on the street was palpable. It was just another day for most people, but not for Michelle Carter. She had just left her office, a quiet, efficient attorney who prided herself on her ability to keep her head down and stay out of trouble. But that day, trouble found her. It all started when a police officer, Officer Greg Thompson, decided to pull her over for what he later claimed was an expired registration tag. It was a mistake. Michelle's car was perfectly legal, and she had all the necessary documentation on hand. But that didn't stop Officer Thompson from stepping out of his patrol car, his hand already resting on his holstered weapon, eyes narrowed. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked. Michelle's heart sank. She had heard stories like this before. The unfair treatment of black people by law enforcement wasn't new, but it still felt like a punch to the gut every time it happened. "Is there a problem, officer?" Michelle asked, trying to stay calm. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she tried to make sense of the situation. "You're being pulled over for a traffic violation," Officer Thompson said curtly, ignoring the calmness in her voice. "Get out of the car now." Michelle hesitated for a second, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on her, the unmistakable judgment that came with the color of her skin. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. The officer's stance didn't relax. He remained rigid, almost hostile, as though he expected her to act up at any moment. But Michelle stood tall, calm despite the rising tension. She knew her rights. "I have my driver's license and registration right here," she said, her voice steady. "May I hand them to you?" The officer didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Michelle felt the weight of his scrutiny, the familiar feeling of being watched not for what she had done, but for who she was. "Get your hands on the car," he suddenly ordered, his voice cold. Michelle froze, confusion flashing through her. "What do you mean?" "Hands on the car. Now." Officer Thompson's tone was sharp. Something was wrong. She had done nothing to deserve this. But she complied, placing her hands on the car, trying not to let her mind spiral into panic. She could feel the heat of the day starting to rise, the sun beating down on her as the officer fumbled with his radio. She couldn't understand why he hadn't yet asked for her documents. Was this a routine check, or something more sinister? The officer's body language screamed suspicion, his posture tense and aggressive. She stood still, trying not to show how her heart was hammering in her chest. Then, the unexpected happened. As Officer Thompson tried to search her car without explanation, another vehicle pulled up beside them. Michelle turned her head slightly, trying to see who it was, but all she could hear was the sound of the approaching footsteps. And then, a voice she knew all too well. "What's going on here, Greg?" It was Detective James Carter, her husband, and he didn't sound pleased. "This is none of your business, Carter," Officer Thompson said, his voice defensive. Michelle felt a chill run down her spine as she realized just how deep this situation had gone. "I don't think that's true," Detective Carter replied, his tone flat and filled with authority. "This woman is my wife. You're not getting away with this." Officer Thompson froze, and for a split second, there was an eerie silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Michelle's mind was racing as she watched the realization dawn on Officer Thompson. His eyes widened in disbelief. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I didn't know," the officer stammered, his earlier aggression now turning into panic. "Get your hands off her," Detective Carter ordered, his voice commanding. Michelle stood there, stunned, as she watched her husband approach. She had been in situations like this before, but this time, it felt different. This time, there was no way out. The officer, still in shock, stumbled back a few steps, his confidence shattered. "You're done," Detective Carter said, his voice low but full of finality. "I'll be filing a complaint against you, Thompson. You'll answer for this." The officer stood frozen, his face turning pale. Michelle could feel the heat of the day intensify, the moment stretching out before her like an eternity. This will not be forgotten, she thought, knowing that things had just taken a dramatic turn. The city might be paying $2.1 million, but that wasn't where the consequences ended. There was a lot more coming for Officer Thompson, and Michelle knew that justice was just beginning to unfold. The tension in the air was thick as Detective James Carter stood face to face with Officer Greg Thompson. The sun continued to climb in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. The bustle of the city seemed distant as the moment between the two men stretched on. Michelle remained by the car, her hand still on the hood, feeling the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. But she couldn't help the knot that tightened in her stomach. This wasn't how her day was supposed to go. Her husband, James, was a seasoned detective. He had dealt with more dangerous situations than she could count, but today, the danger wasn't from a criminal. It was from someone who was supposed to serve and protect. As James approached Officer Thompson, the look on his face told her everything. He was in control, and he wasn't going to let this slide. "What exactly is going on here, Greg?" James asked, his voice calm but laced with authority. Officer Thompson stammered, his face paling at the realization that the woman he had just mistreated was married to one of the most respected detectives in the city. I didn't know," Officer Thompson muttered, his voice cracking. "You didn't know?" James replied, his voice sharp. "You didn't know who she was? Does that give you the right to treat her like this?" Thompson's face reddened as he tried to come up with an excuse, but nothing came. "I'm sorry, sir," Thompson said weakly. "I didn't mean to, no," James cut him off, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving Thompson's. "You didn't mean to? You've already humiliated my wife in public. And now you're going to stand here and tell me it was a mistake?" Michelle could feel the heat of the moment rising, her own emotion swirling in the background as she listened to her husband assert his authority. This wasn't just about her, this was about something bigger. It was about the system, the people in power who thought they could get away with things like this because of who they were. She glanced at Officer Thompson, who looked like a man caught in a storm he had no way of weathering. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by a look of uncertainty. He hadn't expected James, and he certainly hadn't expected Michelle to be someone with connections that ran deep. "James," Michelle said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'm okay. Let's just make sure this doesn't happen again." She looked at Officer Thompson with a steady gaze, refusing to let him see any sign of fear or weakness. She wasn't going to let him have the satisfaction of knowing how much his actions had affected her. James turned to her, his expression softening just a little. "We're not done here," he said, his voice still firm but less harsh. "Thompson, I'll be reporting this. You'll answer for what you've done today." Officer Thompson looked at the ground, his hand nervously adjusting his uniform as the weight of the situation set in. He had no idea what he had just set into motion. The city would pay the price, yes, $2.1 million was just the beginning. But there were deeper consequences coming for him, consequences that would shake his world to its core. "Get back in your car, Michelle," James said, finally turning to her. "I'll handle this." Michelle nodded, grateful for her husband's calm demeanor. She got back in the car, the door clicking shut behind her as she took a deep breath. James stayed outside, speaking to Officer Thompson in a tone that left no room for negotiation. Michelle's mind raced, her thoughts lingering on the events that had just unfolded. The way Thompson had treated her, the way he had dismissed her, as though her life and her rights didn't matter, it was all too familiar. It wasn't just her. It was a system that had been broken for far too long. She didn't know how long the confrontation lasted, but eventually James returned to the car. He slid into the driver's seat, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" Michelle asked, her voice a mix of concern and curiosity. "He's going to face the consequences," James replied, his eyes focused straight ahead. "I've got the paperwork ready. The city's going to make sure this never happens again." Michelle nodded, but she knew it wasn't over. The city could pay the money, but that didn't fix everything. There was a deeper issue that needed to be addressed, and she would make sure it didn't slip through the cracks. As James drove them home, the weight of the situation settled in. Michelle could feel the unease in her chest, a sense of injustice that lingered even as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city streets. Officer Thompson's actions wouldn't go unnoticed. And as the case began to unfold, Michelle knew the real battle was just beginning. As the days passed, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. The events of that morning, the traffic stop, the humiliation, the shock on Officer Thompson's face when he realized who she was, felt like they were only the beginning of a much larger story. It was clear to her now that what had happened wasn't just a random incident. It was a pattern. A pattern of systemic abuse, of unchecked power, and of the kind of racial prejudice that so many people like her had lived with their whole lives. James was handling the immediate aftermath, filing reports, making sure the legal steps were in motion, but Michelle couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of urgency. She knew this wasn't just about Officer Thompson. This was about a culture that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. One evening, as they sat in their living room, James looked up from his laptop, his expression serious. "They're pushing for a settlement," he said quietly. Michelle raised an eyebrow. "A settlement? For what?" "The city's lawyer wants to settle out of court," James continued, his tone tight. "They don't want this to go public. They're offering the money, $2.1 million. But," he paused, clearly weighing his next words. "But that's not enough. That won't fix the real problem." Michelle felt a surge of frustration. She had heard these words before. They were always the same. Money in exchange for silence. Money to make the problem go away. "They want to brush it under the rug," Michelle said bitterly. "They always do." James nodded, his eyes reflecting the same fire that had burned in him earlier. "This is bigger than money. This is about accountability. About making sure this never happens again." Michelle's heart raced as she thought about the people who had been subjected to this kind of treatment day after day. The ones who didn't have the means to fight back. The ones whose stories went unheard. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't just let this go. "What are we going to do?" Michelle asked, her voice steady but filled with determination. James closed his laptop and stood up. "We're going to make sure people know what happened. We're going to make sure this becomes bigger than just us." Michelle stood as well, feeling the weight of his words. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been mistreated, who had been silenced, who had been made to feel less than human. And she wasn't going to let it slide. She wasn't going to let it be swept under the rug. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and emails. James worked tirelessly, coordinating with legal teams, organizing the necessary paperwork, and making sure the story was told. Michelle, meanwhile, began gathering evidence, statements from witnesses, photographs of the scene, and even audio recordings from the day of the incident. The more she gathered, the more she realized how deep the problem ran. This wasn't just about one rogue officer. This was about a system that allowed officers like Thompson to abuse their power with impunity. And it wasn't just about one incident. It was about the countless others that had gone unreported, ignored, or covered up. As the days turned into weeks, the case began to gain attention. The media picked up the story, and soon, it wasn't just Michelle and James fighting for justice. It was a movement. People started coming forward, sharing their own experiences, their own stories of discrimination and abuse. And just as Michelle had hoped, the more the story spread, the more pressure it put on the system. The city couldn't hide behind money anymore. The truth was out. Officer Thompson's actions had not only affected Michelle, but they had affected an entire community. And now, the consequences were catching up to him. Michelle stood in front of the courthouse one morning, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the media swarm around the entrance. The city had made its move, offering the settlement, but Michelle knew the real fight had only just begun. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to stop until every person who had been affected by this kind of abuse had their voice heard. The settlement was just the beginning. The real justice, Michelle knew, would come when people like Officer Thompson were held accountable, when the system was forced to change, and when those who had been silenced could finally speak out without fear. As James joined her outside the courthouse, he looked at her with a mixture of admiration and determination. "We've got this," he said quietly. Michelle nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. "Yes, we do." Michelle stood outside the courthouse, watching as reporters and cameras buzzed around, eager to capture every moment of the unfolding case. The air felt heavy, the kind of heavy that comes with the anticipation of something big. She could hear snippets of conversations, the murmurs of the crowd, but her focus remained on the building in front of her. She had been here before, in other courtrooms, watching as justice was either served or denied. But this time was different. This time, she was a part of the story. James stood beside her, his usual calm demeanor now replaced with a quiet intensity. He didn't say much, but his presence beside her spoke volumes. He knew what this meant, not just for them, but for the community. "We're making history," Michelle thought to herself. It was a sobering realization. The city, the media, the world, everyone was watching. And for once, it felt like the balance of power was shifting. As the days went by, the case continued to gain momentum. Michelle and James worked tirelessly, preparing for the legal battle ahead. Michelle was in the trenches, digging through files, gathering evidence, and ensuring that every voice was heard. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated, for every person who had ever been dismissed or silenced. It was exhausting, but there was a fire within her that wouldn't go out. James, too, was relentless. He was the steady hand guiding them through the chaos, ensuring that their efforts didn't go unnoticed. He spent countless hours meeting with attorneys, reviewing legal documents, and pushing for accountability. Michelle admired his focus, his ability to remain calm under pressure. It wasn't until the morning of the trial that things truly began to feel real. Michelle had never been one to show fear, but as she stood before the courthouse, she couldn't deny the anxiety that was creeping in. This wasn't just about a legal case, this was about a system that had failed so many for so long. It was about breaking that system, exposing its flaws, and ensuring that change was not just a possibility, but a necessity. The courtroom was packed that day. People filled every seat, standing in the back, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Michelle could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the pressure of their expectations. She took a deep breath and entered the courtroom, her head held high. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but she wasn't going to let that deter her. She was here for a reason. As the trial began, the prosecution made their case. The evidence was overwhelming: witness testimony, video footage, and the audio recordings that Michelle had painstakingly collected. The facts were undeniable, but it wasn't just about the evidence. It was about the story that they were telling. A story of injustice, of racial prejudice, and of a system that needed to be held accountable. James spoke next, his words measured but powerful. He painted a vivid picture of what had happened that day, the way Officer Thompson had treated Michelle, and how his actions were not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of abuse within the department. He didn't hold back. He wasn't just talking about Michelle's case, he was talking about the countless others who had been wronged, who had been made to feel less than human. The defense tried to discredit the evidence, to downplay the severity of the situation, but it was clear that they were on the defensive. The more they spoke, the more their argument seemed hollow. They tried to deflect, to place the blame elsewhere, but the facts were there, staring everyone in the face. As the trial progressed, Michelle couldn't help but notice the change in the room. The once skeptical onlookers were now riveted. The air was charged with anticipation, and it felt as though everyone was beginning to understand what this case meant. This was bigger than just one officer. It was about holding people accountable, about making sure that no one could ever abuse their power without facing the consequences. The moment of truth came when Michelle took the stand. She didn't speak with anger, though she felt it deep inside her. Instead, she spoke with calm conviction, laying out the facts of what had happened that day. She spoke of her fear, her confusion, and the way she had been treated, not as a person, but as someone less than. She didn't need to yell. Her words, steady and deliberate, were enough to carry the weight of her message. As she finished, there was a long pause. It was a moment that felt like it lasted forever. And then, in that moment of silence, the truth was undeniable. The jury, the judge, and everyone in the room could see it. Officer Thompson's actions weren't just a mistake. They were part of a larger issue, an issue that demanded attention. The case was adjourned for the day, but Michelle knew that this was far from over. They had made a statement, but the battle wasn't won yet. As they left the courtroom that day, James turned to her, his face softening with pride. "We're doing this," he said quietly. Michelle nodded, feeling the weight of his words. This wasn't just about their family. This was about making sure that the world could no longer turn a blind eye to the injustices that had gone on for far too long. The days leading up to the verdict felt like a pressure cooker. The courtroom was packed, the media attention growing with every passing minute. Michelle had always prided herself on her ability to remain composed under pressure, but this time, as she sat in the witness stand, she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just a case, it was a movement. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on her. She glanced at James, sitting in the back, his gaze steady and confident. He had been her rock through this whole process. The case had become a battle, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, every person whose voice had been silenced by the system. As the trial continued, Michelle couldn't help but notice the way the atmosphere had shifted. At first, the room had been filled with skepticism, with doubt lingering in the air. But now, with each new piece of evidence presented, the room had become more receptive. The arguments for justice were no longer just abstract concepts. They were real, tangible truths that couldn't be ignored any longer. The defense had tried everything they could to discredit the evidence. They questioned the credibility of witnesses, tried to disprove the authenticity of the recordings, and even attempted to paint Michelle as someone who was exaggerating the entire incident. But the more they spoke, the more their words felt hollow. The facts didn't lie. Michelle had been wronged, and no amount of deflection could change that. And then, the turning point came. The defense had presented their closing argument, but it wasn't enough. The prosecution stood, and for the first time during the trial, Michelle felt a sense of certainty she hadn't felt before. The words that came from the prosecutor's mouth were simple, but they carried so much weight. This case is not about one officer. This case is not about one traffic stop. This case is about a system that has failed time and time again. This case is about making sure that no one, no matter their title or position, is above the law. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. It was everything she had been fighting for. It wasn't just about Officer Thompson. It was about dismantling the system of power that allowed him, and so many others like him, to act with impunity. It was about making sure that the truth was heard. As the prosecutor finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. Michelle could feel every eye on her, the weight of the moment pushing down on her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore. The story of what had happened to her wasn't just her story. It was the story of so many others who had been victims of this same system. And she wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours. Michelle's mind raced as she sat in the waiting room with James. She tried to focus, but all she could think about was the potential outcome. What if the jury didn't see it? What if they chose to side with the system, to turn a blind eye to the injustice she had faced? The uncertainty gnawed at her. But James, ever the steady presence, placed a hand on hers. "Whatever happens, we've already won," he said quietly. "This case is about more than just us. It's about everyone who has ever felt powerless. The fight doesn't end here." Michelle nodded, taking comfort in his words, but the nervousness still lingered. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned. The judge called the court to order, and everyone stood as the verdict was read aloud. The room seemed to hold its breath. We, the jury, find Officer Greg Thompson guilty of misconduct in office and abuse of power. The words rang in Michelle's ears like a bell, each one sending a wave of relief and triumph through her. She had done it. They had done it. The system had been held accountable. The room erupted into a mixture of applause and disbelief. Some people were crying, others were cheering, but Michelle stood still, her hands trembling as she clutched James' hand tightly. It wasn't just the conviction of Officer Thompson that mattered. It was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, people were listening. The fight for justice was far from over, but today, they had taken a step forward. The victory felt bittersweet, though. As much as Michelle had longed for this moment, she knew the work wasn't finished. There were still so many people who would never see the justice they deserved, so many others whose stories would never be heard. But for today, this was enough. As they walked out of the courthouse, Michelle couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had never given up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And now, with this victory behind them, she knew that the fight for justice would continue, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly. The days that followed the trial were filled with a sense of relief, but Michelle knew the work was far from over. The victory in court had been a step forward, but the real change she hoped for had yet to come. She spent her days meeting with community leaders, activists, and lawyers, organizing forums to discuss the broader issues of systemic racism within law enforcement. It wasn't just about Officer Thompson anymore. It was about ensuring that the injustice she had faced would never be allowed to happen to anyone else again. As the media coverage continued to spread, Michelle's story became a symbol of resilience. People from all over the country reached out to her, sharing their own experiences and thanking her for speaking out. She had become a voice for those who had been silenced, for those who had never had the opportunity to fight back. James stood by her side every step of the way. His quiet support, his ability to listen, and his dedication to justice had been the steady foundation that allowed her to keep going. He was proud of her, but he also understood that the battle they were fighting was just beginning. The media attention had brought the issue to the forefront, but now, it was up to them to ensure that the momentum didn't die. Michelle knew that real change would take time. Laws needed to be reformed, police departments needed to be held accountable, and communities needed to come together to support one another. It wasn't going to be easy, but Michelle had never backed down from a challenge. She wasn't going to start now. One afternoon, as Michelle sat in her office, reviewing documents for an upcoming town hall meeting, there was a knock at the door. She looked up to see a young woman standing in the doorway, nervously wringing her hands. "Ms. Carter," the woman asked. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. You've given me the courage to speak up about what happened to me." Michelle smiled softly and gestured for the woman to sit. "You don't need to thank me," she said, her voice warm. "I'm just doing what's right. But I'm glad my story helped you find your voice." The woman sat down and began to share her own story, a story that mirrored Michelle's in so many ways. She spoke of being stopped by a police officer, being treated with suspicion, and being humiliated in front of her peers. It was heartbreaking to hear, but it was also a reminder of why Michelle couldn't stop fighting. "I don't want what happened to me to define me," the woman said, her voice shaky but determined. "I just want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Michelle nodded. "That's exactly why we have to keep going. It's not about us anymore. It's about the future." As the young woman left, Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but the more people who spoke up, the more they could make a difference. It was clear that the fight for justice wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Michelle and James spent the next few months working tirelessly, pushing for changes within the police department and advocating for reforms in the law. They attended rallies, spoke with lawmakers, and met with other victims of police misconduct. Everywhere they went, they found people who were ready to stand up, who were ready to demand accountability. Michelle's voice was strong, but it was the collective power of the community that made the difference. Slowly, the tide began to turn. More and more people were beginning to see the truth, and the pressure on the system grew. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but every victory, no matter how small, felt like a step closer to the world Michelle and so many others had been fighting for. One morning, as Michelle sat in a meeting with several community leaders, her phone buzzed. She glanced down and saw a message from James. "We did it. The city council passed the new police reform bill. It's just the start, but it's a huge step." A wave of relief washed over Michelle. They had done it. The fight was far from over, but this was a monumental victory. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to breathe. She wasn't just fighting for her own justice anymore. She was fighting for the justice of so many others who had been silenced, who had been ignored, and who had been dismissed. She knew there was still much to do. The work wasn't done, and the road ahead would continue to be long and difficult. But for now, in that moment, Michelle allowed herself to feel proud of what they had accomplished. They had made a difference. And with that difference came the hope that, one day, the world would be a place where justice wasn't just a concept, but a reality for everyone. The months after the reform bill passed were a blur of new challenges and hard-won victories. Michelle had never imagined that the journey would be so long, but now that the momentum was building, she couldn't stop. She found herself speaking at conferences, rallying support from community leaders, and working with activists to ensure that the police reform efforts didn't lose steam. The media continued to cover the story, and she knew that the spotlight would eventually fade. That was the hardest part, keeping the focus on the long-term changes that were needed, not just the immediate consequences. Michelle wasn't interested in short-lived victories. She wanted to change the system for good. One evening, as she sat with James at their kitchen table, papers scattered in front of them, she finally allowed herself to reflect. James had been her rock, but Michelle had never felt more certain of the path ahead. The city had taken a step toward justice, but the fight wasn't over. "It's happening, James," she said, her voice full of resolve. "People are listening now. They're starting to understand that this is just the beginning." James looked up from the documents, his gaze steady. "I know. And we're not stopping until we see real change. But you're right. We've only just started to scratch the surface." They both knew that the battle for true justice wasn't easy. There would be more obstacles, more people who didn't want things to change, but Michelle had seen enough to know that the system could be changed. She believed in it, and she believed in the power of people coming together. The next few weeks brought even more progress. The City Council voted to implement further reforms to ensure that accountability within the police force was taken seriously. A new oversight committee was formed, and Michelle was invited to sit on it. It was a huge honor, but it also meant more responsibility. It was a challenge she was ready to take on. This is how it happens, Michelle thought to herself as she sat in her first meeting with the new committee. She looked around the room at the diverse group of people who had come together for the same cause. They were all there because they wanted to make a difference. This is what change looks like, she told herself, nodding slightly as the meeting began. As the months passed, Michelle continued to lead efforts to ensure that the reform initiatives were properly implemented. She worked closely with other organizations, speaking at town hall meetings, and encouraging the community to stay involved. There were moments when things seemed to stall, but Michelle kept pushing forward. She knew how important it was to maintain momentum, and she wasn't willing to let the progress they had made slip away. One evening, she received a call that she would never forget. It was from a young man who had been wrongfully detained by police years ago. His story mirrored Michelle's own in so many ways. He told her that he had been inspired by her fight for justice, and that he had finally found the courage to speak up about his own experience. "I don't know what to say," the young man said, his voice shaking. "But I've been holding this in for so long, and I just wanted to thank you. You made me believe that it's okay to stand up." Michelle felt a lump form in her throat. "You don't have to thank me," she replied softly. "You're not alone in this. You have the right to be heard, and you deserve justice just as much as anyone else." The conversation was brief, but it left a lasting impact on Michelle. It reminded her that the work she was doing wasn't just for headlines or recognition, it was for the countless people who had been wronged and who had never had the chance to fight back. It was for those who had felt powerless, who had felt invisible. The next morning, as she walked into the office to begin another busy day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. There were still so many battles to be fought, but she knew that the tide was turning. More people were speaking out, more people were demanding change, and more people were coming together to fight for what was right. As she sat at her desk, reviewing another pile of documents, Michelle paused for a moment. She thought back to that day when everything had started, the day Officer Thompson had pulled her over and changed her life forever. In many ways, that moment had been a catalyst. It had pushed her to take action, to make a difference. But it had also shown her something much bigger, the power of one voice. I've come a long way, she thought, staring out the window. But we still have a long way to go. She wasn't done yet. Michelle had always known that the fight for justice would never truly end. But that didn't matter. Because with each step forward, with each voice raised in solidarity, they were changing the world. And that was something worth fighting for. The following months felt like a whirlwind for Michelle, as the work she had started continued to snowball. The reform that had started in her city had gained national attention, and it seemed as though every day brought new conversations, new partnerships, and new calls to action. But even with the weight of all this on her shoulders, she never wavered. The city was listening, and she wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. One evening, as she sat at her desk, papers strewn across the surface in front of her, Michelle reflected on how far they had come. It wasn't just about Officer Thompson anymore. This was a movement, a collective push for change that was reverberating across the country. Every day, Michelle received messages from people who had experienced the same kind of discrimination, who had been denied justice for too long. Some of them were just now finding the courage to speak up. Others had been silenced for years, but they were finally starting to feel that their voices mattered. That was the real victory, Michelle realized, the way people were coming together to stand against the system, the way they were demanding accountability. She wasn't the only one fighting anymore. It was the entire community. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. It had all started with a single act of injustice, a traffic stop gone wrong. That day had changed everything. Officer Thompson's actions had set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. But as the months went by, it became clear that what seemed like a random encounter had opened up a much larger conversation. James entered the room, his expression unreadable. He sat down across from her, a folder in his hands. "What's going on?" she asked, sensing the seriousness in his demeanor. "I've just received an update," he said, placing the folder on the table. "The department is finally taking some action. They're starting to implement some of the reforms we've been advocating for. It's a step in the right direction." Michelle felt a rush of relief, but she knew it wasn't enough. "This is just the beginning," she said, looking at him with a determined gaze. "We've come this far, but we still have work to do." James nodded. "I know. But it's a victory. A big one." They both understood that the road ahead was long. It wasn't just about getting laws passed or reforming the police department. It was about changing the culture, about shifting the mindset that had allowed these abuses to happen in the first place. The moment was bittersweet, though. Michelle knew that for every victory, there were countless others who hadn't been able to speak up, who hadn't had the resources or the support to fight back. But this was her fight now, and she wasn't going to stop. Over the next few weeks, Michelle continued her efforts, working closely with community organizations, organizing meetings, and pushing for further accountability within the police force. Her name had become synonymous with the movement for justice, and as much as she appreciated the recognition, she knew the focus had to stay on the bigger picture. She wasn't doing this for accolades. She was doing this for every person who had been wronged, for every person who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter. One morning, as she walked into the office, Michelle received another call. It was a young man, his voice shaky with emotion. "Miss Carter, he started, pausing for a moment before continuing. "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story gave me the strength to speak out about what happened to me. I don't know what to do next, but I needed to say thank you." Michelle smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. "You're not alone," she said gently. "And I'm here to help. You've already taken the first step." The conversation left Michelle feeling a sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced in a long time. This wasn't just about the reforms that were being implemented or the changes in the police department. It was about people finding their strength, their voice, and their power. As she sat back down at her desk, she felt a renewed sense of responsibility. The journey was far from over, but with each passing day, she saw the impact of their work. People were beginning to believe in the possibility of change. Michelle knew that their efforts had already started to make a difference, and that gave her hope. This wasn't just about justice for one person. This was about justice for all. And with that thought in mind, she got back to work, ready to continue the fight until it was truly over. As Michelle continued her work on the police reform efforts, the changes she had fought for were beginning to take root. The pressure for transformation was undeniable now, and though the battle for justice would never be simple or fast, the city had begun to shift. The city council had implemented many of the proposed changes, but Michelle knew that the real impact would come from within the communities themselves. The police force had agreed to new training programs, increased accountability, and the formation of oversight committees, but Michelle still felt the need for greater public involvement. It wasn't enough to simply make changes behind closed doors. The community needed to see and feel the transformation. As she continued to attend meetings and organize forums, Michelle began to see a new wave of people stepping up. It wasn't just about talking anymore, it was about action. People who had once been quiet, hesitant, or afraid to speak out were now finding the courage to do so. They wanted change, and they were no longer content with standing on the sidelines. Michelle had become a figurehead for the movement, but it was clear to her that it was the collective effort of the people that was truly driving the progress. One afternoon, as she stood in front of a crowd at a town hall meeting, Michelle felt the weight of her role in this movement. It was a pivotal moment, a chance for the community to come together and express their concerns, their hopes, and their frustrations. Michelle had always been a good listener, but today, as the room filled with voices, she realized how much more there was to be done. As she opened the floor to questions, a woman in the back stood up. Her voice was strong, but there was an underlying sadness. "I've been following this movement," the woman said, her eyes scanning the room. "And I just want to know, how do we keep the pressure on? How do we make sure this doesn't just fade away like so many times before?" The question hung in the air, and Michelle could feel the eyes of the room turn to her. This was the challenge, wasn't it? The real challenge wasn't getting the ball rolling. It was keeping it in motion. "That's the hard part," Michelle said, stepping forward and meeting the woman's gaze. "Change is hard. And it doesn't happen overnight. But we're already seeing it. This movement, this community, it's not going anywhere. We have the power to keep this going. But it's going to take all of us." The woman nodded, and there was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Michelle could feel a surge of hope. She knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time, she felt confident that they were on the right path. As the meeting wrapped up, Michelle walked to the back of the room where James was waiting for her. He smiled as she approached, but his eyes were full of concern. "How do you feel about today?" he asked, his voice quiet. Michelle hesitated for a moment before responding. "I think they're ready. I think the people are finally ready to push for what's right. We just need to keep showing them that it's possible." James nodded, his expression softening. "We've made a lot of progress. But you're right, it's just the beginning." Michelle thought about his words as they left the meeting together. The reform, the new policies, the movement, it was all vital. But it was only part of the equation. The real change would come when the people who had been impacted most by the injustices began to take ownership of their own futures. When they could stand up and say, "This is our fight, too," that's when the real power would shift. Over the next few months, Michelle worked tirelessly with the community to ensure that they stayed engaged, that they stayed informed, and that they didn't back down. She knew that there would be setbacks, that the system would push back. But as long as the people kept pushing, as long as they kept speaking up, Michelle knew they could make lasting change. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table with James, the quiet in the house felt comforting. There were still challenges ahead, still battles to fight, but Michelle felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for a long time. She had fought for justice, and she had seen the power of people coming together to demand change. That was something no one could take away from her. "We've done good work," Michelle said, looking at James across the table. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We've only just begun," he replied. And Michelle knew he was right. The fight for justice, the fight for real change, would never end. But they had taken the first steps. They had shown the world what could happen when people refused to stay silent. And for Michelle, that was enough to keep pushing forward. The city had begun to change. The work that Michelle and James had done over the past year was slowly beginning to ripple out, affecting more and more people. There were still challenges to face, still voices to be heard, but Michelle could sense that the tide was turning. The police reforms were now a permanent part of the system, but the real victory lay in the growing empowerment of the community. They had seen the power of their own voices, the strength they had when they stood together. It wasn't just about the new laws or policies anymore. It was about the shift in culture, the realization that they had the ability to demand what was right. Michelle had spent so much of her life focused on the legal battles, the specifics of the case, but now, she saw something much bigger. She saw a movement that was larger than any one person, any one story. And it was gaining momentum. As the weeks went by, Michelle continued her work with the community, visiting local schools, organizing town halls, and ensuring that the reforms were actually being put into practice. She was no longer just fighting against the injustices she had faced personally. Now, she was helping others find the strength to fight for their own rights. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, and there were still people who tried to resist change. But Michelle refused to let that stop her. She couldn't, not when she had seen the difference they were making. One afternoon, as Michelle sat in her office preparing for another meeting, she got a message from James. "We need to talk. It's important," he wrote. A sense of unease washed over her as she read the text. She immediately called him. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's about the police department," James said, his voice tense. "They are not following through with some of the reforms. There's resistance at the highest levels. It's going to take more than just the city council to make sure this sticks." Michelle's heart sank. She knew that change was always hard, but she hadn't expected the resistance to come so soon, or so strongly. "What can we do?" she asked. "We need to get the community involved. This can't just be about the reforms anymore. We need to make sure the police force knows that the public is paying attention. If we don't, they'll think they can get away with it." Michelle knew he was right. They had fought for these changes, but they needed to be vigilant. She wasn't going to let the system slip back into old habits. "I'll start organizing something," she said. "We'll make sure they know we're not backing down." Over the next few weeks, Michelle worked with James to gather support from community organizations, local activists, and anyone who had been impacted by police misconduct. They organized rallies, meetings, and petitions, making sure that the voice of the people was heard loud and clear. The police force couldn't just dismiss the public outcry. They had to answer for their actions. As the pressure mounted, Michelle received a call from the city's mayor. "Michelle, I know you're fighting for accountability, and I want you to know that I'm behind you," the mayor said. "We're going to push for the department to fully implement the reforms, and if they don't, we'll make sure the public knows." It was a small victory, but it felt like progress. Michelle thanked the mayor and hung up, her mind already racing with what needed to happen next. "We can do this," she said to James, determination in her voice. "We have to." Over the next few months, the pressure continued to build. The police force, now under the public's watchful eye, had no choice but to comply with the reforms. Michelle's work had made a difference, but it wasn't just her fight anymore. It was the fight of everyone who had ever been wronged, everyone who had ever been denied justice. The community had found its voice, and together, they had made sure that the system would be held accountable. As Michelle stood at the front of another town hall meeting, looking out at the crowd of people who had come to support the cause, she felt a deep sense of pride. They had come so far. And she knew that their fight wasn't over. But for the first time, she felt like they were on the right path, that real change was not only possible, but already happening. The work was far from done, but Michelle was no longer fighting alone. She had a community behind her, and together, they would continue to push for justice. It was a long road ahead, but Michelle had no doubt that they would make it. They would keep fighting, because that's what change required. And with each step they took, they were shaping a future that would be better for everyone. Michelle had learned that the path to real change was neither quick nor easy, but as she sat in the quiet of her office one evening, she realized how far they had come. The momentum they had built was still strong, and the community's engagement was at an all-time high. There were still days when the weight of everything threatened to pull her down, but those were the days she would remember why she started in the first place. To see the changes they had fought for becoming a reality, to see people standing up for justice and accountability, it made all the struggles worth it. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from James. "Meet me at the community center. There's something you need to see." She quickly grabbed her jacket and headed out the door. When she arrived, she found James talking to a group of people in a circle. His face lit up when he saw her, and he motioned for her to join them. "I think you'll be happy to see this," James said, stepping aside to let Michelle through. As she walked into the circle, she saw what he meant. In front of her was a group of young people, teenagers mostly, standing with confidence. They were holding signs, each one with a message about justice, accountability, and change. It was clear that this wasn't just a group of kids mimicking what they had seen on TV or heard in the news. This was a group that understood the power of their voice. "We've been organizing," one of the teenagers said, a young woman named Jasmine. "We're ready to keep this fight going. We want to show the city that we won't let up." Michelle's heart swelled with pride. This was the next generation, the people who would carry the torch forward. "This is incredible," Michelle said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You all are leading the charge now." Jasmine smiled, holding up her sign. "We learned from you. Your fight gave us the strength to fight for our own future. We know what needs to be done." Michelle felt a rush of emotion. It wasn't just about the policies anymore, or the reform laws that had been passed. It was about the movement that had been sparked, the fire that had been ignited in the hearts of people who were ready to stand up, speak out, and demand a better future. Over the next few weeks, Michelle worked closely with the young activists, helping them organize rallies, workshops, and forums where they could share their stories and ideas. Their passion was contagious, and it energized Michelle to push even harder for the changes they had all been fighting for. But there were still obstacles to overcome. Not everyone was as eager for change, and there were still those who fought tooth and nail to maintain the status quo. Michelle knew that even though the reform laws had been passed and the police force was under greater scrutiny, the real work was in changing the hearts and minds of people who had been complacent for far too long. One day, Michelle received a call from the mayor's office. She knew that the fight wasn't over, but she hadn't expected the call to come this soon. The mayor's voice on the other end of the line was calm, but Michelle could sense the urgency. "Michelle, we need your help," the mayor said. "There's a group trying to block the next phase of the police reform initiative. We need your voice to help push this through." Michelle didn't hesitate. "I'm in," she said. "Whatever it takes." She knew that this was a crucial moment. The momentum they had built needed to keep moving forward, and she wasn't about to let anyone stand in the way of the progress they had made. Over the next few days, Michelle worked closely with the mayor and other leaders to rally support for the next phase of the reform. She spoke at town halls, met with city council members, and rallied the community to speak out. The opposition was strong, but Michelle was determined to make sure that the changes they had started would continue. The battle wasn't over yet, but Michelle felt something shift inside her. The resistance that had once seemed so daunting no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like an opportunity, a chance to show just how strong the community had become. As the vote for the next phase of the reform drew near, Michelle stood in front of a crowd of supporters, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment that would determine the future. "We've come so far," Michelle said, her voice strong and unwavering. "But we're not done yet. This fight is about all of us. It's about ensuring that every person in this city is treated with respect and dignity. We've fought for change, and we're not stopping now." The crowd erupted into applause, and Michelle could feel the power of their voices behind her. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was their fight. And together, they would make sure that change wasn't just a dream, it was a reality. The next day, the city council voted, and the next phase of the police reform initiative was passed. It was a victory, but Michelle knew it was just another step. The road was long, but with the community behind her, she was ready to keep fighting. She wasn't just working for justice anymore. She was working to create a future where every person, regardless of who they were or where they came from, could live in a world where justice was the rule, not the exception. As the weeks passed, the victory of the recent reform seemed to spark a renewed sense of determination within the community. Michelle could feel the difference in the air. The streets, the meetings, the conversations, everything felt more alive with purpose. People who had once been quiet, resigned to the way things had always been, were now speaking out. The energy was undeniable. But as she worked alongside James, helping to guide the next steps of the reform, she knew that their progress was fragile. The resistance to change wasn't gone, it was just lying low, waiting for an opening. The system was always going to push back, but Michelle had learned that the key to lasting change wasn't just passing laws. It was about keeping the conversation alive, keeping the community engaged, and, most importantly, making sure the momentum didn't fade. One afternoon, as she walked into a local community center to attend another meeting, Michelle was greeted by the familiar faces of activists, community leaders, and parents who had been impacted by police misconduct. There was a sense of unity in the room, but there was also something else: resolve. It was as if everyone understood that the fight was ongoing and would require constant vigilance. Michelle, one of the leaders, Marcus, said, standing up to greet her. "We've got to keep pushing, but we need a strategy. This doesn't end with the reforms we fought for. We need more." Michelle nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. "You're right," she said. "The real work starts now. We've made progress, but it's not enough. We need to make sure these changes actually stick. We need to focus on how to keep holding the system accountable, and that means involving the community every step of the way." As she spoke, Michelle felt the weight of her words. She knew how much work was still ahead, but she also felt the power of their collective will. The room was full of people who had suffered, but who also had a vision for a better future. The strategy sessions that followed were intense, but they were also full of hope. Ideas flowed freely, each person contributing their vision for how to keep pushing for change. Michelle listened carefully, taking in every suggestion. They discussed building alliances with local schools, engaging more with youth, and making sure that the police force itself was not just held accountable by city officials, but by the community. "If we let this become a one-time victory," Michelle said, "we'll be letting them win. We need to build on this momentum, make sure people know we're watching, and keep the pressure on. It's not enough for the police to say they'll change. We need to see it." There was a murmur of agreement around the room. Michelle's words resonated with them, as they too recognized the importance of staying involved, staying informed, and never letting their guard down. Over the next few months, Michelle worked tirelessly alongside the community to implement these ideas. They organized marches, protests, and informational sessions, making sure the police reform remained at the forefront of everyone's mind. The media continued to cover the developments, but Michelle knew the media's attention was fleeting. It was up to the people to keep the movement alive. As the year progressed, Michelle began to see even more change. There were new training programs for officers, and the oversight committee had started holding public meetings where people could voice their concerns directly to law enforcement. The community's voice was louder than ever, and that was something Michelle would never let fade. One evening, as she sat down at her kitchen table, James joined her with a cup of coffee. "You look tired," he said, sitting across from her. "You've been pushing so hard." Michelle smiled faintly, the exhaustion in her eyes a reflection of the months of work. "I'm just getting started," she said, taking a deep breath. "I know the fight's not over, but we're making a difference. I can see it." James reached across the table, taking her hand. "You've already changed so many lives, Michelle. You've sparked something that can't be put out." Michelle squeezed his hand. "It's the people," she said. "They've done this. All we did was help light the fire. They're the ones keeping it burning." In that moment, Michelle felt a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The work would continue, but she knew that they had done something important. They had taken a stand. And they were not going to stop until justice was no longer something they had to fight for, it was something everyone had access to, every single day. The fight for change wasn't easy. It never would be. But Michelle now knew that with every voice raised in solidarity, with every person willing to fight, they could make the impossible possible. The journey wasn't over, but the foundation was solid. And that, Michelle knew, was the beginning of true transformation. As the years passed, Michelle watched as the city she had fought for continued to grow and evolve. The police reform that had started with a single act of injustice had now become a part of the city's fabric, woven into the very culture. The road had been long and often exhausting, but Michelle felt a sense of accomplishment that she could never have imagined when she first started. The change was tangible now. The streets felt different. People were more engaged, more aware of the power they held. The youth, especially, had taken charge, and Michelle was proud to see the next generation of activists rising to the occasion. James, as always, stood by her side, unwavering in his support. But even with all the victories they had achieved, Michelle knew that the work would never truly end. There would always be more to fight for. One morning, as Michelle was preparing for a meeting with a new group of activists, she received a call from the mayor's office. She hadn't expected this. "Michelle, we need you to come down to City Hall," the mayor's assistant said. "The mayor wants to speak with you about a new initiative." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. She had worked with the mayor on many projects before, but this sounded different. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, hanging up the phone. When she arrived at City Hall, she was greeted by the mayor himself. "Michelle, thank you for coming," he said with a warm handshake. "I wanted to talk to you about something important. Something that could take this reform effort to the next level." Michelle's curiosity piqued. "What's this about?" "We're ready to roll out a citywide initiative focused on racial equality and police accountability," the mayor explained. "But we need someone who understands this fight. Someone who can bring the community together and lead the charge. We want you to be the one to spearhead it." Michelle stood there, taken aback by the offer. She had never expected this kind of recognition. "I'm honored," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But I can't do this alone. We've built something here, and it's been a collective effort. It's not just me. It's all of us." The mayor nodded. "That's exactly why we want you. You've shown us what's possible when the community is united. You've built something real. Now, we want you to lead us into the next phase." Michelle took a deep breath. She knew this was a big responsibility, but it was also an opportunity to make a lasting impact. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "But we have to keep involving the people. We have to make sure they know that they are the ones driving this change." The mayor smiled. "That's the spirit we need. Let's do this together." Over the next few months, Michelle worked closely with the mayor's office to design the initiative. It was ambitious, aimed not only at improving police practices but also at addressing the root causes of inequality in the city. It would involve education, community engagement, and a focus on the issues that mattered most to the people. Michelle knew this was a monumental task, but with the support of the community, she felt ready. The initiative launched with a citywide rally. The streets were filled with people from all walks of life, all standing together to demand change. Michelle stood at the front, feeling the energy of the crowd behind her. It was the same energy she had felt when she first started this journey, but now, it was even stronger. "This is for all of us," Michelle said into the microphone, her voice strong and clear. "This is for every person who has been treated unfairly. This is for every voice that has been silenced. We are making history, and we are doing it together." The crowd erupted into applause, and Michelle felt a sense of unity that she had never experienced before. They had come so far, but this was just the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over, but now, Michelle knew, they had the power to keep pushing forward. As the rally came to a close, Michelle looked around at the sea of faces. She saw hope, determination, and the belief that they could create a better world. And for the first time in a long time, she felt that hope, too. The work was far from done, but with each step forward, Michelle knew they were making progress. The city was changing, and it was changing because of the voices that had risen up, the people who refused to stay silent. And as long as there were people willing to stand together, Michelle knew that real change was possible. The future was brighter now, and it was only going to get brighter from here.